of labor Zionism gave Ben-Gurion the pride of being more important than himself to Jewish history. Second, it means that maybe without Ben-Gurion, Jewish history would have been different. Now, please remember that Berl Katzenelson died in 1944. He did not see the establishment of the Jewish state, but he foresaw Ben-Gurion's role in what is going to happen to the Jewish people within less than a decade. And this reflects the wisdom of Berl Katzenelson and also the fact that people, some people, not many, understood even then that Ben-Gurion was going places. Now, Katzenelson said what he said to younger guys, people that were members of a youth movement called Hamachanot HaOlim that did not appreciate Ben-Gurion. And he said to them, and I heard it from them, you do not understand. You do not appreciate Ben-Gurion enough. Ben-Gurion is the gift of history to the Jewish people. And just think about the situation. A leader of the same generation of Ben-Gurion, almost the same age, that is considered the more important from him, is recommending him to the younger generation so that those people would understand what is at stake. And it's a very revealing situation.
So Katzenelson saw something in Ben-Gurion, saw leadership, saw, and I want to talk about that, about what made Ben-Gurion a great leader, his impact on history, but help us understand, because the story you tell in the book is sometimes you can tell from a young age someone's going to change the world. They're a charismatic leader, right? They are built for this. But that's not the story you tell in this book of a young Ben-Gurion.
That's right. When I think about Ben-Gurion, I remember visiting the town where he was born, Ploensk. I say Ploensk even though Jews were saying Ploensk. And they were saying Lodz when the Polish were saying Łódź. So I visited at Ploensk because today there are no Jews in Ploensk. But at Ben-Gurion's time, that 2/3 of the people in Ploensk were Jews. And they lived, most of them, around the so-called Rynek, the square where all the rich merchants were living. When I visited Ploensk, the mayor of Ploensk said to me, we can show you the addresses of all those who lived around the square. And I felt the hidden anti-Semitism in this saying, meaning that all the rich people were living around the square. Now, Ben-Gurion's family did not live there. They lived in the alley of goats. What do you mean, an alley of goats? It's a small alley. Nobody important is living there. It was a family of lower middle class. Ben-Gurion, who was never a snob, on one thing he was a little snobbish. He described his father as a lawyer. His father was no lawyer. His father was what we call in Yiddish a Winkeladvokat. Namely, he was sitting at the corner of the courthouse and writing petitions for the peasants who came to town. It was a really Nebuchadnezzar family, but nevertheless, the father discovered that he had a gifted son. And what does he do? He writes a letter to Herzl, asking for his help, for his assistance to send this boy to a middle school, because in Ploensk there was no middle school. There was no train station. This was a really backward place. When I compare the beginnings of, let's say, Herzl or Chaim Weizmann with those of Ben-Gurion, these two figures went to university, had a profession, a completely different world. Ben-Gurion, this boy, we don't know exactly what he did after he left the Talmud Torah. And he roamed around until he discovered politics. And he discovered politics in 1905 because at that moment there was the first Russian Revolution. And suddenly he felt a vocation. He suddenly felt that he belonged to something. He joined the party Polizio, which was a socialist Zionist party. And from that moment, he knew what he wanted to do. He went to Palestine in 1906 as a boy of 20 years old. He did not know almost anybody there. Maybe he followed his sweetheart that went on the same ship to Palestine. I don't know. But actually, if I want to look at his development, he started to show his promise after World War I, which means he was already in his 30s. And he did not make his mark until his 40s. Now, it reminds me the story about Julius Caesar, who came to the grave of Alexander the Great and cried because he, Caesar, was already 40 years old, and at that time, Alexander the Great was, at that age, was already dead after conquering half the world. So Ben-Gurion, it took him a lot of time to become a leader. First of the Jewish community in Palestine, or I would say even before that, of the Zionist socialists in Palestine, of what would be Mapai. This was the first decade of his leadership. The second decade was when he became leader of the Zionist organization, chairman of the Jewish Agency, And the third decade was the decade when he became the leader of the Jewish people and recognized by the world. But you have to understand that until 1948, the British saw him, I would say, as somebody of secondary importance. For them, only Chaim Weizmann was important. Now, this fact is reflected in the book of Who is Who. You know, there are books, Who is Who, that were published each year in England. On Chaim Weizmann, you had such a long entry about Ben-Gurion. You had 3 or 4 lines about the leader of the workers, of Jewish workers in Palestine. This shows you that his emergence as a leader in the 40s and his acceptance first by the Jewish people and then by the larger world was very late. At that time, he was already called by the members of the Palmach or the Haganah, the old man, Hazaken. This was the title that he was given. But for the whole world, he was just a new arrival.
So as I'm listening to you sort of trace the trajectory of his leadership, I'm thinking about the quote in your book, how Ben-Gurion had I think you say he had a great sense of the moment, right? He knew when to act.
Yes.
Right? And I think that's something that's you contrast him to Weizmann in that way. So talk to us about this trait of Ben-Gurion, a couple instances maybe, or even just one of when he knew this was the time to act.
The first time that I think it was reflected very clearly was in the elections to the Zionist organization in 1933. At that time, the greatest Jewish community was in Poland, millions of Jews. They should vote to the Zionist organization, and they should be those who elect the Zionist executive. And Ben-Gurion understood that in order to lead the people, he needed to have the majority in the Zionist organization. And against the advice of all his colleagues, he decided that he's going to get the majority in those elections. There were 2 trends in ascendancy in Poland at that time. The left-wing Polei Zion and the right-wing, the revisionists. And the leader of the revisionists was the charismatic Zev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was a great speaker, but Ben-Gurion was a great organizer. And he, at that moment, decided that he is going to conquer the millions of Jews in Poland. And how would he do that? He would organize the elections, I would say, like a general organizes a battle. He found new enthusiastic activists, not the old party leaders, young chalutzim that wanted to come to Palestine and needed the certificates. And they were fighting for Ben-Gurion hoping that he would get for them the certificates. He was not a good speaker like Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was a great orator. Ben-Gurion was a tedious orator, but he, as I said, was a great organizer. And he organized these young people in every village, in every shtetl. And he cajoled them, and he talked to them, and he demanded them to give reports every time. And he won the elections. This was what gave Mapai the leadership until 1977. So here we have the first first expression of Ben-Gurion's feeling for reality. The second would be in 1941-42. He came to the United States as a completely unknown person. So much so that the official in Ellis Island put him in quarantine for a few days. Now, he was already the leader of the Zionist organization in Palestine, but he was completely unknown outside. So he came to this country. Again, nobody knew him. And a few months later, he wrote in a letter to his daughter, Renana. We have the letter. What did he say? That after the World War, America was still not in the war. After the war, there are going to be just two great powers, America and the Soviet Union. Now, stating such a statement at that time was something out of the ordinary. If you asked Chaim Weizmann, he would not dare to think in such directions. Here was Ben-Gurion understanding the historical process. What's more, he wanted to mobilize America for the Zionist cause. And he wrote exactly what should be done. America was maybe friendly, maybe not friendly to the Zionist cause. But we needed to have the support of the American president against the British influence on the State Department, on the State Department. Now, how do you make the president do that? You have to organize, and he wrote what I say. You have to organize public opinion. You have to organize the Jews as a pressure group. And in order to that, you have to make them influence the unions, the churches, the universities. And when the American people would accept the idea of a Jewish state, the president won't have any other way but to do the same. And this he did, this concept he developed in 1942. It did not work out so quickly. It took some years, but the ideas were already there. And I think that it's brilliant of a person that was not involved in American life to understand so deeply how a political movement is created in this country.
I want to pick up on another moment of him sensing the moment, and that was 1948,
yes,
which is within the decade that you talk about as the sort of 42 to 53.
The magnificent
correct.
decade.
So Ben-Gurion declares statehood, and you write in the book, quoting Ben-Gurion from 1951, there was nothing that the Jewish people yearned for more over hundreds of years than a Jewish state. There was nothing the Jewish people were less qualified for than a Jewish state, right? And you go on in other places to describe the real gamble that Ben-Gurion took here. This is 3 years after the Shoah,
yes,
and he's gambling with the lives of a lot of Jews. In addition, and you mentioned this both in the 1947. November 29th UN declaration, and then again after statehood, while people are dancing in the streets celebrating, Ben-Gurion is thinking about the impending doom that's coming, knowing that there will be, there will be a war here. In addition, there's also the state building that has to happen, right? The identity that has to be created of these immigrants who are in Israel. So there's a lot going on to this quote, nothing we yearn for more than a Jewish state, nothing we were less qualified for a Jewish state. Can you talk about this moment in Ben-Gurion's career? An amazing moment of leadership, right? But, right, it's like, the most important day is after the day of declaration, yes, when you have to go vote and you have to build a state and you have to make the government run. Right? This is a force of nature that Ben-Gurion was to make this happen. Can you talk about this moment of 1948 and the several years after that, of the beginning of statehood?
Ben-Gurion was a leader like some of the leaders that emerged in the period of the Second World War. People that were gifted to become leaders in times of crisis. Now, Ben-Gurion wrote in a letter to Paula about Churchill. He said, I don't believe that leaders make history. History is made by multitudes. But sometimes, in a crucial moment, a courageous, wise, and willing to take risks leader makes the difference between victory and defeat. Now, he was talking about Churchill, but the same is true about him. Ben-Gurion was a master of calculated risks. Now, just imagine the situation in 48, when on the eve of Declaration of Independence. This group of Jews that were the provisionary government, they did not know, they never had experience with such decision. They hear from the future Foreign Minister Moshe Sharet, that came back from the United States, that he talked with the Secretary of State, George Marshall, a great military leader, that told him, don't listen to young generals. You are going to be beaten by the Arabs, and we are not going to save you. postponed the creation of the state for a few months. At the same time, Golda Meir comes back from a visit to Abdallah in Transjordan, and the conclusion of her visit is that he's going to join the Arab states that are going to invade the country. The military leaders are asked for their assessment of the situation. Are we going to win or are we going to lose? And they answer 50-50%. And now this group of people, unexperienced, and believe me, with no special intelligence, are to decide whether to declare or not to declare independence. On the radio, they hear about the last messages from the Etzion bloc that was overrun by the Arabs, and the defenders, most of them were killed. Now, what are you to do? If you were a provisionary minister, what would you decide? In this situation, Ben-Gurion had to make them decide to declare independence, because there is no such thing as a vacuum. The British are going to evacuate the country, and there is no way that we can lose this moment, this historic opportunity. And after many hours of debate, the decision falls to declare independence. The decision is taken by one vote. I once gave a talk about it in London, and the moderator asked me, what would Ben-Gurion do had the decision gone to the other side? And without thinking, I said, he would make them change their mind. And I think that it's true. He would not leave that room without the decision to declare independence. And this is leadership. Leadership that appears in crucial moments. Now, Ben-Gurion was not all the time the great leader. I think that he was very good in crucial moments. He was exceptional in times of crisis. After the times of crisis, I would say after 53, 54, after the great wave of immigration, and after the first American loan, and the beginning of the discussions about reparations with Germany, Ben-Gurion felt that the moment of crisis has passed, and that's why he could go to Sde-Boker.
He retires, basically,
yes.
in 1953.
Yes, but he came back.
Right.
Now, this is to show that even he understood that running the country, making a people out of those multitudes of immigrants that came from 20 countries and spoke 10 languages and represented at least 5 cultures. He didn't know what to do with that. And I think this was his tragedy. because winning a war, establishing a state, and even establishing the framework of this state was not the same thing as educating the people to become a people. And this was something that cannot be done in one generation, and it was not something for a person so driven to action as Ben-Gurion.
Well, in some ways, it's a very Jewish approach to time of, I've done my share, I have a larger vision of time, and not just in the moment, but knowing that there will be generations, people to pick up the sacred work of actually implementing the vision that he spent his life formulating.
But he came back.
He did come back.
You know, this raises the question, which I like very much. When should a leader retire? It's a good question. Ben-Gurion retired the first time in '53. He went to Sde Boker, and at that time, the whole nation was appalled. Suddenly, we were orphans. Our founding father left us. And the letters that were sent to Ben-Gurion from all over the country, children and grown-ups, thousands of letters, were pleas for him to return. How can you leave us? And he returned 2 years later, not because of the pleas of the people, but because there was a balagan in the matters of defense. Was he right to come back? Well, after that, we had the Sinai campaign that, even though some people think that it was a mistake, it gave Israel the 10 most important years of peace and quiet that enabled creating a people out of this multitude. This was one thing. You know, when the elections were held in '59, Ben-Gurion got the biggest support ever. Mapai got 49 mandates for the Knesset. And then came the Eichmann trial. Ben-Gurion standing in the Knesset and announcing the capture of Eichmann. This was something that was so moving. Now, had he retired then, this would have been beautiful. But he stayed on and got mixed up with the so-called Esek Abish. And he fought with all his comrades. And when he eventually retired in '63, there was a feeling that, yes, it's enough. It's time for him to retire. So when should a leader retire?
I ask this all the time, and not just with leaders, but you see professional athletes who stay on just a little bit too long, or they retire and they don't know what to do with themselves.
And professors.
The wisdom grows,
yeah.
Right? But you know, that Eichmann moment, you're right, would have been a good mic drop, walk off the stage moment, and because in a way, I see that moment as crystallizing everything that the new Jew and the state of Israel
That's right.
represents. And,
I agree.
And he just couldn't walk away. So I want to, because are we here till 10 tonight, or what time are we going till? Because I've got a lot to talk about. But I do want to ask, because you can't really speak about the beginnings of the state without talking about Ben-Gurion and his relationship with the Palestinian Arabs there. So just talk, and then maybe we'll take a couple audience questions after that, and then I'll sort of bring us back and wrap things up. But can you talk about Ben-Gurion in relation to the Arabs? And because I know that there was a shift there, right, in his feelings.
When he came to Palestine, he believed, first of all, like Ber-Borochov, that the Jews and the Arabs are actually brothers, because the Arabs are Jews that converted to Islam. And this was a very accepted view among Poalei Zion. But even then, he had no illusions that he has to create, to be a defender of Jewish lives, Jewish property, etc., etc. Then, when he came back from the United States in 1921, he was one of the developers of the theory that the way to treat the Arabs is like brothers, the simple Arabs, the peasants, the poor people. Socialism would solve their problems, and we and the workers, the Arab workers, both stem from the same soil, and our roots join together in the soil. This is a quote from his book, Anew Shchenenu, we and our neighbors. And this view was the result of, I would say, the attempt to neglect the vision of the emergence of Arab nationalism, because socialists cannot be in clash with a national movement. No, we are not in clash with the national movement. This is not a national movement. These are just capitalist effendis that exploit the poor peasants, and we are going to organize them, and this would be the future. But in 1929, after the riots then, that were more serious than previous riots, he stated at the meeting of Mapai, and this was a great revelation. He said, "This is a national movement. It does not have the attributes of national movements in Europe, namely, it does not have the cultural background, but it concentrates multitudes of people. And in this sense, this is a national movement, with very acute understanding of Arab nationalism." Now, how are you a Zionist in a land where you at that time are about 15%, and you continue to grow your children there and to hope for the best? You believe that you can reach an agreement with the Arabs. How do you reach the agreement? You can either propose division of power, or division of territory. So at the beginning, he suggested the division of power. We would reach this or that schedule of, not partition, of parliamentary organizations. Maybe there would be two houses, a house where the population numbers would be shown, and another house in which the Jews would have the upper hand. Some kind of schedule like that. And when he became chairman of the Zionist organization, he for 2 years tried to reach agreement with Arab leaders. He believed, and he still was a bit naive, that if he was honest and sincere and would tell the Arabs the truth that, yes, we want a Jewish majority in this country, but we would give you this and this and this, and we will bring you the beauties of advancement and prosperity, etc., etc. After 2 years, he understood what Musa Alami told him. Musa Alami said, I prefer to ride a donkey for another 100 years, but not to have you around here. And he wrote in his memoirs, I understood what he said. He was an Arab patriot. And for Ben-Gurion, this was the end of the story. From that moment on, he did not believe in any agreement. He was never willing to give up on one thing in all the schemes that he suggested. The one thing that he never compromised on was Aliyah. Aliyah was the A and Z of his Zionism. And what's interesting was that he made it clear to the Arabs that we are not going to give up the idea of Jewish statehood, of Jewish majority. I am not sure that he said statehood, but he did say majority. And he understood that what the Arabs would be willing to give us was to be a small minority in an Arab state. And this was not the aim of Zionism.
Professor, while we tee up a question, I want to read a part from the book in this spirit of, Aliyah being so important and immigration and getting the numbers up so it wasn't a significant minority. You talk in the book about Ben-Gurion in the DP camps.
Yes.
Now, there's something you write, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, that has an important connection to this synagogue. You write that Ben-Gurion tried to visit Poland but was prevented from doing so. Instead, in October 1945, he visited the DP camps in Germany. It was the first visit to the camps by any Jewish leader. Ben-Gurion was the only Zionist leader to visit the camp several times. The first direct encounter between the survivors and the man who signified hopes of a new life for them occurred at the camp in Zilsheim. He arrived in the car of the chief Jewish chaplain of the American Army, a rabbi named Judah Nadich, who was the rabbi at Park Avenue Synagogue.
Really?
Chief chaplain, when several survivors recognized the striking head with its mane of white hair, they began chanting. I mean, you can imagine. All right? Ben-Gurion, Ben-Gurion. Nadich assured them that Ben-Gurion was going to address them. And in Nadich's description, as Ben-Gurion stood on the platform before them, the people broke forth into cheers and song and finally into weeping. At last he began to speak. Nadich continues, his eyes filled up. His eyes filled. He had to stop as he broke down for a moment. In the sudden quiet, one could hear the muffled sobbing from all sides of the auditorium. Very few eyes were dry, for the incredible was true. The impossible had happened. Ben-Gurion was in their midst, and they had lived despite Hitler.
Yes.
They had lived despite them all to this day, when they could welcome Ben-Gurion with Rabbi Judah Nadich. Questions? Let's take a couple questions, and then I'll ask you one concluding question, and people can get their signed copies of your outstanding book. Go ahead, sir. Yeah. And please keep a question to a question. That means there's a question mark at the end. All right?
First, I do have to compliment the book. The first 30 pages alone is what I've read. It's an education in and of itself, so thank you. My question is this. The relationship between Ben-Gurion, Menachem Begin, and Yitzhak Shamir. It is painful to think of our founding fathers, Jefferson, Adams, and Hamilton, actually disliking each other, being like scorpions. What was the relationship between Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, and Ben-Gurion?
How much time do we have for this one, huh?
Well, I would say like that. Ben-Gurion, all his life, feared Jewish anarchism and feared the appearance of groups that do not accept civil authority. Now, it started with the Hashomer, and it went on with the Irgun, and it went on with, later on, the Palmach. He dismantled all organizations that did not accept the monopoly of power of the state. And this was why he could not stand begging. Shamir is a different story. Shamir, you know the story, he joined the Mossad, and so Ben-Gurion did not carry a garage, but Begin was different. And nevertheless, in '67, when there were the 2 weeks of waiting before the war, and there was a feeling of insecurity among the public because the government was hesitant, Begin went to visit Ben-Gurion. Did you know that? Begin went to visit Ben-Gurion and offered him to become prime minister, to come back to become prime minister. Ben-Gurion, of course, turned him down. But from that moment, they were friends. And Paula always said that she liked Begin much earlier. Paula, by the way, had a knack for understanding people, while Ben-Gurion had no understanding at all of people.
Yeah, I would like the next time you come here to just spend the hour talking about that relationship, because we're not going to get to the Altalena. We're not going to get to the reparations conversation, which Begin was ready to bring down the government. But that relationship, I think, is extraordinary. And the story you just told is for people who don't know that there was some, if not a love by the end of their lives, certainly respect, I think, is from a rabbi's perspective, it's a sermon waiting to be written. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So, Professor, I want to ask. And again, there are things that we are not touching on because of time that I think are important conversations. The moments of Jewish history, like the Altalena, like reparations, like Eichmann, like the status quo agreement, that are covered in the book. And I really do commend the book to you. It's an extraordinary biography, incredible archival work, and just a lot of insights into to Ben-Gurion both as a politician, as a leader, as a human being, and talking about his human relationships that he had. Last question. Is there a state without him? Could the state of Israel have been founded without Ben-Gurion?
This is a good question. When I look at the gathering of the provisional government, I don't see there anybody who was capable of taking a decision that meant war, that meant sending thousands of young men to be killed, a kind of decision that no Jew ever took since the times of Bar Kokhba. Now, who was capable of doing it? I don't believe that even Berl Katzenelson was capable. Nobody was capable of doing it except Ben-Gurion. He knew the risks and he was capable of taking the risks. And as Golda said, not because he was not afraid, but despite being afraid. And this is a great leadership, because this is going against the grain of your instincts, your fear. You are doing the right thing because it is the right thing.
I'll add to that your words at the end of this book. At the critical moment in a delivery, the role of the midwife is decisive. This was Ben-Gurion's role. One can always play the game of what would have happened if. Perhaps the state of Israel would not have been established if not for Ben-Gurion. Perhaps those who proposed postponing the decision or giving up on the idea of a Jewish nation state and establishing a binational state were right. These are hypothetical possibilities that will remain in the sphere of intellectual speculation. The determining factor was Ben-Gurion's presence at the helm at the decisive moment. He was the one who brought the Zionist dream to fruition. It's a great paragraph.
Thank you.
Professor, I want to thank you both personally. Just a great privilege for me to sit with you and talk Zionist history and the presence of a great historian. And on behalf of the community, I want to thank you from all of us, for your presence and for an extraordinary hour. Please purchase the book. It's not, as I said, it's not just about Ben-Gurion. It's about the birth of this extraordinary nation. Professor Shapira will be in the back signing copies. I want to thank you all for being here and wish you a good evening.